Shana Tova. In the Talmud, in Tractate Bava Metzia, Abaye and Reb Papa, two 4th century Babylonian rabbis, got into an argument. And like many arguments in the Talmud, what they disagreed about was which of two earlier authorities held differing opinions on a matter of Jewish law. You see, you could see it either one of two ways. Say you have an argument with your brother, for example, about a disagreement that went on years ago between your great aunt and your great uncle. You say it was your great uncle that loved the Red Sox, and your great aunt loved the Yankees for some reason. But your brother says it was the other way around. She loved the Red Sox. And then he throws in the fact that Ted Williams was a much better all-around baseball player than Joe DiMaggio. And now you have a full-blown rabbinic kerfuffle. Getting back to the case of Abaye and Reb Papa, they were attempting to establish the basis for determining a fair market price for olive oil, which was a precious commodity in the ancient Near East. It turns out that olive oil was sold filtered. No sediments were supposed to be in it. And the authorities carefully watched the sellers and the purchasers' assumptions about how much of this excess material got through the process anyway, got mixed in. And they'd established the price based on the divergent assumptions. So that's the subject of the argument. So after Abaye lays out his reasoning, lines up which side took which role in the argument, Reb Papa turns around and says, no, you've got it totally backwards, how they argued it out. And he offers an 180-degree differing explanation about who, more than a century earlier, took which position and the reasons behind those positions, what was motivating each of them. Ipcha mistabra, the Talmud says. It's Aramaic for things can be understood the other way around. It's the Talmud's way of saying, hey, you might think that here, this is the logic behind a certain dispute. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to illustrate an opposing, maybe even counterintuitive way of looking at the disagreement. You can see it from a different angle entirely. Ipcha mistabra. An editorial writer in Haaretz on August 1st, in a paper that's totally secular, used the term, the Aramaic term from the Talmud, to make his point. He suggested that in political circles, we should all be asking what may be counterintuitive, even shocking, about why Netanyahu would assassinate the political leader of Hamas in the middle of Tehran, if the guy was a key player in negotiating a diplomatic solution to the hostage crisis and ending the war in Gaza. And of course, keep in mind, in the middle of summer, this is long before the assassination of Nasrallah or the decapitation of Hezbollah. The guy who got killed, Ismail Haniyeh, was a bad guy, for sure. But do you assassinate someone who's working on negotiating a peace deal, or at least a ceasefire? At the time, most commentators just drew the conclusion that Israel may have overshot its goals, made a tactical blunder. But the same writer went against the grain by suggesting that Netanyahu intended it. He did it deliberately. He outsourced a tenet of Israeli escalation domination strategy to Iran by calling its bluff. letting Iran figure out what level it would decide to retaliate. The reason for this, he continued, is that the Israeli prime minister actually wanted Iran to bear the risk of confronting the US. Force Iran to think about a larger war it can't control by upping the stakes for itself and its proxies and sucking America into it. And at the same time, the Israeli prime minister would divert attention, of course, away from the war in Gaza. I'm not getting into this. We don't need more politics. You see, we have enough of that. But what I'm curious about is this way of thinking, going with what's counterintuitive that's happening right in front of us. We're often so sure about how things have reached the stage they're in right now. But just suppose we pause to ask an alternative set of questions. In the dazzling novel, Kairos, by Jenny Erpenbeck, a young woman from East Berlin falls in love with an older married man from the other side, only a year or so before Germany is reunited. As the wall falls, her reality and her fantasies disintegrate. Better yet, they're subsumed within a new mental and emotional mapping. And all that remains of a long, illicit affair is a ritual they go on performing whenever they part company. In Erpenbeck's words, when they leave a place together, he holds out her coat, and she slips into it frontwise, briefly holds him in her arms, then slips it off and puts it on the right way. Ipcha mistabra. I can remember as a really young child walking down what I thought was a long hall in my house. At the end of that hall was a thin mirror. And I, to this day, recall peering behind the glass of that mirror in the hall to see if there was something there looking through it back at me. Getting to the truth can be more than simply arguing the other side of a debate. That's hard enough. Standing in someone else's shoes, figuring out what's mutual, what's complementary. But sometimes it's looking at the obverse of what we think we know. For everything we commonly think of as being true, solid, there may be, in fact, something more unsettling to it. At the end of July, it was reported that William Calley died in a hospice in California. And for those of you who were born long after the Vietnam War, Mr. Calley was synonymous with the My Lai massacre, the mass murder of a village filled with defenseless women and children, old people. Although in so many ways, his conviction told us something more. It stood in for a senseless war fought by Americans for a regime that was terrible and corrupt, a war that our society eventually came to realize it should have no part in. and it unmasked a larger issue. That something in our society had failed, and we need to look ourselves in the mirror. Coincidentally, the same day that it was reported that Callie died, it was also reported that a Palestinian prisoner was abused in the crudest way by Israeli soldiers. And were it not for a whistleblower, there was a likelihood that others would get away with the same abhorrent behavior, and in fact, probably already had. And yet there were loud protests in Israel by people who think it's somehow unfair to point fingers, to accuse prison guards, who, after all, are put in charge of the worst of the worst. That's what they say. Ipcha mistabra. I wonder what these moments mean for our hopes. What does it say about our illusions in a larger sense? How do they speak to our commitments to one another, to shaping, to envisioning a better world? Can we in here on Rosh Hashanah marshal the fortitude to peer behind the hellscape of the kibbutzim that were devastated on October 7th of last year? The charred remains of homes, the wreckage of a dance festival. Is there a way for us to see behind the mirror? Well, maybe it's for this reason that we cover the mirrors in a house of mourning. And then there's the cruelty to the hostages underground that keeps us looking away. Ipcha mistabra. Have you read Percival Everett's great literary invention called James? It takes Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and turns it around so that we explore, we come to know what's behind the opaque figure of a slave, however benevolent the character of Jim is in the original famous book. In Everett's telling, that same black human being, invested with dignity and chutzpah, is brazen enough to go out and steal a pencil. And he's hidden it away deep inside of his pockets, because if he's caught with it, he's liable to get hung. You see, the pencil is more valuable than anything else. And in Everett's words, he writes himself into being. In fact, James, say his name. James' supple use of language is his character's animating force. He's not just intelligent. He's not just a reader. But he's a human being with his own desires and imagination. And what you get is there's another side to Twain's story. And I also go so far as to say that Huckleberry Finn, in each telling of the story, is a child who's a tabula rasa. He's malleable, somewhat sympathetic, not yet formed. Our humanity without the artifice of race that reflects what could be someday true of all of us. But in the meantime, it's James who comes into focus in this new telling. Ipcha mistabra. And the same pattern of obfuscation and recovery holds true for Viet Thanh Nguyen, the writer of that wonderful novel from a few years ago, The Sympathizer, but who also wrote a scholarly nonfiction work entitled Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War. He calls attention to the design of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., its shiny, black granite surface as bringing not just the names of those lost American soldiers front and center, but we, the viewers, can see ourselves looking at it, observing it. And the wall provokes some anxiety. There's this mirror effect. And suddenly, we are implicated. And it subverts the patriotic American framing of this war being our tragedy. Because we're looking away. We're omitting, after all, the memories of millions of dead Vietnamese. And he calls it a disremembering. And I realize that back in March, Lisa and I took a trip to Vietnam. And I was hoping, quite naively, I think, as a Jew living at a time when our prospects for tomorrow are up in the air, to understand from them over there how and to what extent they, the Vietnamese, have come to terms, wrapped their arms around the past, maybe even embraced more openly, more graciously, a different kind of future. But in wishing to see these things all repaired, wasn't I disremembering too? I wonder how the Vietnamese will write themselves into being again. So look, we know right now we're standing at a crossroads in modern Jewish history. And it's going to take decades to sort this thing all out. What we in the Jewish world should want, whom it is we think we serve, whom we fail to serve, and the memories that are abundant clouding our vision. There's that mirror we hold up, as does Sarah Imenu, Sarah, a matriarch, in today's Torah, coming right up, whose opening line in the first Aliyah will read, Vadonai pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar, Vayas Adonai l'Sarah ka'asher diber. And you hear the meter of it. It's translated, God remembered Sarah, just like God had said. Then God will wrap things up like God had said. It's poetic, better in the Hebrew. The verb pakad, however, does not mean to remember simply. It means God performed an accounting, as if there was something yet owed. And the commentator Malbim explains that although God had predicted the birth of a child in Sarah's old age, to her, it was until this point lacking in any credibility, unresolved for her. What with her passive husband yielding to her jealousy, nonchalantly leaving Hagar with her toddler out in the cold, the family in turmoil. And after all, Sarah famously laughs out loud. She finds God's prediction funny, even a bit disturbing. In today's troubled Torah narrative, amidst her doubts, in fact, the future hangs in the balance. And after all, this is today's Torah, the Torah that the rabbis chose for us to read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, that's being written into being right now. That's if we together can hold the pen in hand and manage to write it in a coherent manner. Nachman of Bratslav teaches that when We are despairing about the world, about our lives, about our handle on it, at odds with the people around us. We can become like a blank slate, a book that's empty. Every one of us can be like a human being, she'en lo sefer, he says. A human being with no scroll open, or the scroll's open, there's nothing on the page. It's vanished. So he says, we begin from this place of no place, and yet there's this one thing that we could say that we have deep in our hearts. Perhaps it's curiosity. Perhaps it's this blazing desire to learn what we're supposed to do. And that's if we can get it together, can hold the pen in hand. That's if we're able to remember. And how does Nachman set it up? This moment. He says it's like this, that somewhere out there in the world there are two tzaddikim, two righteous people. And they're involved in a conversation. But the only thing is, this is a problem. They're walking on two separate paths. One tzaddik over here on this side of the world, and one tzaddik over there, maybe on another continent, or maybe it's like being online. But he goes on to say that there's this one tzaddik over here who poses the question, and there's another tzaddik over there. And he offers an answer, a way to figure it out, a question and an answer. But again, it's just speech, which is sometimes cacophonous. It's our voices, nothing more than that. But they can add up. And it's the vibrations that can unite. Nachman says, producing the purest sound. And this voice of God is the thing that ultimately can connect us to one another. And it's this voice that gets written down in a Sefer Zikaron, the book of remembrance. We can remember who we are. We may have, during a long, hard year, forgotten something about ourselves. What we really stand up for. It's possible. We may have on the arduous path, amidst our arguments, our public statements, our gatherings in solidarity or in protest, lost track of who we are, where we can vibrate with the truth, where the truth of humanity is. James Baldwin said it, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Ipcha mistabra. Things can sometimes be explained the other way around in a way we have as yet not fathomed or refused to see. We may never, in fact, have expected it. We may never have imagined an entirely different future. Or maybe we disremembered it all along. But somehow, in seeing things differently, it might yet help us get at the truth. On this Rosh Hashanah, this day of remembering, may we loosen the shackles of ideology, slacken just a little bit the cords of fear and recrimination and sanctimony, and help our adversaries, our neighbors, and even the ones we love who've hidden their faces from us at times, to write ourselves into being. May we all be written and sealed for a year that gives us new life and hope, and God willing, a focus on peace. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Joey. Shukar.